Today's story, as you know, is one of the most familiar in the Bible. It's one that probably most of us heard for the first time as children, maybe in Sunday school in the days where there were such things. And you've probably heard many a sermon on this passage. And so you may already feel you know what's coming. And maybe you're right, but maybe there's some fresh nugget to seize hold of, or an old familiar truth which can speak afresh to you and your situation and our church's situation this morning, in whatever storm you may be in, or just come out of, or just about to go into. But you see, there I am straight away looking at the symbolism of the story, when what we need to do is firstly understand what is going on, the facts, the context. So I want us to go on a little bit of a journey of discovery through the various layers of this story. Tom spoke recently in the evening about the layers of interpretation that we can give to Scripture. So let's go on this mini voyage, and we'll pause to try to get some idea of at the first level of understanding, and then move further down, as it were, into different layers. So we'll move from a literal boat on a literal lake to a group of people sat in a church 2,000 years later. Actually, apart from me, you are all sat in a boat. Did you know that? Because you're in the nave. And the nave, of course, comes from the Latin word navis, meaning ship, from which we get our word navy and naval, because the church is likened to a ship. So you're sat in the boat and I'm up here on the poop deck or something like that. I better not say poop deck at the 11 o'clock service with children present. So firstly, let's notice that Jesus was tired. He was tired. And perhaps not just tired, but exhausted. He's been responding to the needs of so many, many people, and that is tiring. Matthew and Mark both refer to the crowds that kept surrounding him in the time building up to this. People who wanted his attention. Matthew has Jesus healing a leper, followed by the healing of the centurion's servant, about which Pippa spoke eloquently last week, and then healing Peter's mother-in-law there in Capernaum by the lakeside. And he's been teaching the crowds in parables. And even in the evening, Matthew says, many were brought to him in the evening. Ministering to people is exhausting, isn't it? Whether you are a teacher, a vicar, a rector, a carer for someone with a debilitating or terminal illness, whether you're a nurse, whatever it is, giving of yourself to people day in and day out is draining. You remember what Jesus said when the woman touched him in the crowd. Something has gone out of me, he said. It's draining. Do you know, this story here is the only place in the Gospels that we read of Jesus sleeping. We sometimes read that he spent all night in prayer or went off to solitary places, but never, apart from here, that he went to sleep. So he must have been very tired, because he falls asleep pretty quickly on the back of a boat. And even though Mark says he had a cushion, it can't have been very comfortable. So he must have been dog-tired. And what can we draw from the fact that Jesus is tired? Well, of course, and this is where we get into the layers of interpretation, this points to his humanity and his human nature. As far as we know, the angels don't need to sleep. And we're told that God our Father neither slumbers nor sleeps. But a feature of all human beings is that we get tired and we need our sleep. And in the theological wrestling that the early church and the church fathers who came after them had to do was to describe who Jesus was, his nature. In what sense was he divine? Was he divine at all? In what sense was he human? Was he human at all? That divinity and humanity of Jesus is something that is hard to grasp and to conceptualize. But the gospel writers here are making it clear that Jesus was not a kind of ghostly angelic apparition, but a man of flesh and blood. He grew tired. He needed to sleep. He became thirsty and hungry. He did bleed if you pricked him. He wept. He got angry. He was tempted. So the fact that all three gospel writers mention the fact that he went to sleep, needed sleep, is a little piece of evidence of his genuine human nature. But then we see later, we'll come to that the story also illustrates his divine nature. So much so that these close friends of his all ask the same question in each of the three Gospels. Who is this that we're dealing with? What kind of a man, what kind of a person is he? Now let's notice whose initiative it is to go on this journey, this boat christening. It's Jesus. And that's significant because of what's happened. Matthew says, when Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross the lake. He ordered them, get in that boat, we've got to get out of here. Luke and Mark put it slightly more gentle when Jesus says, let's go across to the other side. But the initiative to set sail is Jesus. It's not a whim of the disciples, thinking their own thoughts and doing their own things. This is important to understand, because when the boat gets into trouble, as it does, there's no need to blame themselves. You know, there's another storm in the New Testament, the one that Paul was caught up on in the Mediterranean. And it lasted for many days on that occasion. And before it, Paul warned the captain of the ship not to set sail. If you do, you're going to have trouble. And they did. And Paul later on says, I told you so, but you wouldn't listen, would you? Not so here. It was their very following of Jesus that landed those disciples in trouble and in that fearful situation. And although we do see their shortcomings later in the story, their lack of trust, we must also recognize at this point, whatever misgivings any of them may have had, and some of them, as we shall see, were fishermen, they got into that boat and followed him into that boat. Where he goes, I will follow, they said. It is sometimes the case that following Jesus gets you into trouble, gets you into all sorts of difficulties. It's obviously very true when we're talking about persecution, as the early Christian faced and as many in the world do today, but it need not just be persecution, the trouble that one gets into by following Jesus. Spurgeon, preaching on this incident, says, the storm was the more trying because it came upon them when they were in the path of duty. Have you ever felt that? I've just been trying to do what I can, and it's all going wrong. Spurgeon says, their master had bidden them cross the sea. They were not upon a holiday trip. They had not even followed the suggestion of a brother who said, I go a-fishing. They were steering under the great captain's orders. They were doing right and suffering trouble in consequence. And then Spurgeon says, this has often perplexed good men and women. Too right. Have you ever felt, as I say, you've tried to do the right thing, follow what you thought was the Lord's guidance, and then found yourself saying to God, to quote Oliver Hardy, here's another nice mess you got me into, God. The wonderful Matthew Henry, Spurgeon and Matthew Henry are my favorite writers, says this. One would have expected that having Christ with them, they should have had a very favorable crossing. But it is quite otherwise. For Christ would show that they who are passing with him over the ocean of this world to the other side must expect storms by the way. Those who are passing over the ocean of the world to the other side must expect storms by the way. I hope you'll bear with me if I make a little parallel with the situation we find ourselves in with the Rock Project. We are being buffeted by some winds and waves at the moment in terms of what to do. And it's challenging. There are some in the boat saying, press on. It's a test of faith. There might be some saying, I said we shouldn't come this way. Who knows? Mark. Right? Well, yes, and that's the difficulty, because we're all different here. But we're all trying to follow the Lord. So let's think now about these disciples. Now, the gospel writers don't say exactly how many there were, but if we assume it was the 12, what do we know about them? Well, we know that at least 3 or 4 of them are fishermen. Peter and his brother Andrew, John and his brother James. Surely, as seasoned fishermen, they would have been very familiar with storms on the lake. Well, actually, I'm not so sure. Apparently, storms on Lake Galilee are comparatively rare. probably due to its sheltered low location. But even if they were used to it, what about the non-fishermen there? Matthew, the accountant, the tax collector, the man from the Inland Revenue, Philip, Bartholomew, landlubbers, all of them. No wonder they were scared witless when the storm came up. We've often spoken, haven't we, of the motley crew that Jesus gathered around himself. Well, here we see again another instance of a group of people mostly not fitted for what was about to come upon them. It's very likely that none of them could swim, and certain that quite a few of them didn't know the first thing about sailing, let alone sailing a boat in a storm. It's not difficult to see the symbolic parallels, is it, with ourselves? Do you feel ill-equipped to serve God? Not talented enough? Not experienced enough? Not holy enough? Not dedicated enough? Not familiar enough with Scripture? Not eloquent enough? Not prayerful enough? Well, all those not enoughs make you enough for God's team. As someone once said, God does not choose the qualified. He equips and qualifies those he has chosen. Most, if not all of those called to serve God in Scripture are all too well aware of their lack of natural gifts or their weaknesses or their fears. Now the storm itself, it's described as a furious squall. The waves are coming over the boat. The boat is in danger of being swamped. They are genuinely, as Luke says, in danger. I've never literally been in that predicament. I think there are one or two sailors here. John Barnett here, you're a sailor. I expect you've been in some storms, have you? Yeah, and others, and Sally with you? Yeah. But most of us don't have the literal experience of being in a storm like these disciples. However, I dare say that most of us have felt from time to time in our lives that our boat, our lives, our situation has been hit by a storm of events and circumstances, and that you've just felt overwhelmed, or to use the phrase, swamped. You may have felt that you were in danger of sinking altogether, of losing much or all that was precious to you, of running aground, of drowning. You know what it is to be buffeted by the waves of life, mostly through no fault of your own. Sometimes you may have felt you brought the storm on you, as did Jonah, but the storms of life are something that everyone faces, and nowhere are we told, as said earlier, that being a Christian inoculates you against those storms or prevents them happening. No, what we are told is that whatever the storm, however strong the winds, however tall the waves, metaphorically speaking, however much water we're taking on board, that Jesus is there in the boat with us, that God is faithful, that he will never leave us or forsake us, even if it does appear that he's sometimes asleep on watch. Someone has said that to have God in your life does not mean sailing seas that never have storms, but sailing on a boat that can never sink. Sailing on a boat that can never sink. I wonder what shouted conversations between the disciples took place before Jesus was awoke. Luke just simply says they woke Jesus, but they didn't suddenly all go wake him up, did they? They must have been talking and arguing and discussing beforehand. If there were 12 of them, I guess they weren't all of the same mind. Not all were terrified, perhaps, out of their minds. Perhaps some still trust that with Jesus in the boat, all will be well. Some believe that they can see out the storm and that land is not very far away, as indeed it wasn't. It was only 7 miles between the two shores. In any church council, there are a variety of degrees of faith, of temperament, of insight, of spiritual character and experience. There's usually no single point of view or single spiritual assessment of the situation. So in this storm-tossed boat, I wonder who, if any, were calm, who was scared, who it was that shook Jesus to wake him up and shouted at him, "Lord, wake up, save us. Don't you care what's happening to us right now?" I expect we've all prayed a prayer like that sometimes, haven't we? King David prayed plenty of them like that. Psalm after psalm, "Lord, what are you doing? Where are you? Help me, Lord, I'm in trouble." And Christians down through the ages have prayed prayers of desperation, prayers out of fear, prayers in the face of death, prayers in the face of crises, seemingly going badly wrong. "Lord, save me, and I will, Lord. Lord, don't you care what's happening to me and my family? Lord, why are you silent? Why are you sleeping?" You know, it is all too easy to be a confident Christian when the sun is shining, isn't it, and the winds are calm. It's a different matter when the dark night is upon us and the winds are howling all around. And then it's easy to forget, as the song has it, and the God of the good times is still God in the bad times, and the God of the day is still the God of the night. And in this case, this is a point when Jesus steps in. Maybe to his disappointment that he has to step in. I think this is a miracle that wasn't supposed to happen at one level. Jesus wanted to sleep all the way across. He didn't want to get up and have to do more ministry, I think. But in God's economy, in God's planning, in the great narrative of Scripture, we see something else because he steps in. If the tiredness of Jesus reveals his humanity, now his rebuke to the winds and the waves reveals his divinity. When he is woken by the disciples in their fear, he stands fearless and rebukes the winds, just as he, same word, rebuked the fever in Peter's mother-in-law and rebuked the demons that he was to encounter shortly. The opening letter of John's Gospel tells us that through Jesus, the world came into being. There was not anything created that was made without him. Paul in Colossians tells us that all things hold together in him. So Jesus, in his divine authority, empowered by the Spirit, is able to order the winds and the waves to cease their raging. And you know, if we go a deeper level, this display of authority also highlights the central mission of Jesus, which is to bring peace and reconciliation. Peace be still. Here he brings peace to nature and all becomes still. This is his mission. This is his promise to those who follow him. This is the ultimate destiny of the world. Paul says God was in Jesus Christ reconciling, making peace, bringing peace. Isaiah prophesies that Jesus is the Prince of Peace, and Jesus himself breathes peace upon his disciples. He is the God of peace, and his mission is ultimately not to bring peace on a little lake, just to a peace on a lake 2,000 years ago, but to bring peace to a world that still groans with earthquakes and climate disaster, to a world divided by wars, to troubled individuals, the bringer of peace. And this display of authority and power leaves the disciples now with a different kind of fear to the one they've been experiencing. In the storm, they've been petrified of dying, but now they're overawed and possessed of a godly fear as they see this display of divinity. So much that they ask themselves a question that's been asked down the centuries and which we must all ask and answer. Who is he? Who is this person? What kind of a man is he? And the answer, of course, is he is unique. He is both God and man, united in one person, touched by the limitations of humanity, but empowered by the authority of divinity. I'll end with a question that Jesus put to those scared, witless disciples. Why are you so afraid? Why do you have so little faith? Is he saying that to me today? Is he saying that to you today? Is he saying that to our church today? And I don't just mean the project, but about a whole host of things. Where is your faith? Where is your trust? Where is your willingness to follow me? Are we a fearful people or a faithful people? Are we intimidated by the circumstances in our lives or trusting in the goodness and faithfulness of God for us and for the church? Well, Jesus asks some hard questions, doesn't he? But may God give us the honesty to answer the questions that he asks us and to trust him even when the storms are raging and when we're being buffeted by the winds. Amen.